Olga Meshoe is a South African native and the CEO of Deceit International, which stands for Defend, Embrace, Invest and Support of Israel. She is also a faculty member and regional director at Club Z and a board member of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. She is an internationally sought after speaker on African relations with Israel and the Christian bond with Israel, and has spoken at APAC conferences, as well as to Jewish student organizations across the United States. In 2016, she received the Jerusalem Award from the World Zionist Organization in recognition of her exceptional advocacy and personal courage. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
It is a pleasure to be with you all today and to participate in a conference of such great importance. Racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia are very real issues with very severe consequences that deserve earnest and committed actions from the United Nations, its member states, non-government organizations, and religious and civil society. However, we are days away from the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of Durban One, a gathering that promised to address the scourge of racism in its various forms, yet itself committed an act of racism against the Jewish people. Israel was the only country singled out for its supposed racist treatment of the Palestinian people. It was the only nation that was labeled a racist apartheid state that committed acts of genocide and practiced ethnic cleansing. The direct effect of these absurd lies has been an increase in Jew hatred worldwide. An indirect effect of Durban One against Israel is a price Africa and Africans have had to pay and continue to pay. Before examining the price Africa and Africans pay for the Israel is an apartheid lie, I wish to lend my voice as a native South African to the corrective call that Israel is not an apartheid state. Israel's existence, its political policies, its cultural and social practices are unmatched to the politics, cultural and social practices of apartheid South Africa. They also do not fall within the definition of apartheid as set out in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. To claim so is to espouse an egregious lie that is an anti-Semitic attack against the diverse and democratic state of Israel. Durban One spawned the establishment of the BDS movement, the modern era effort to isolate Jews and delegitimize the state of Israel. Unlike the aim of the boycott and sanction efforts against apartheid South Africa, which sought the dismantling of an evil racist system, BDS unapologetically seeks as its ultimate goal the destruction of the state of Israel. BDS and other related efforts of hate against Israel and the Jewish people have succeeded in their efforts with the support of African nations participating in fraudulent pro-human rights gatherings by world bodies and institutions. I'm yet to read of what the BDS has done to improve the lives of Africans who support it. To the contrary, BDS antagonizes the constitutionally enshrined rights of South Africans. The organization regularly calls for South Africans not to travel to Israel. It led a campaign to block much needed assistance to a drought crisis in South Africa. And it attacks support for Israel in accordance with people's religious beliefs. Earlier this year, Israel was rightfully awarded observer status at the African Union. Arab leaders have led the protest by African voices in denouncing this move. But I ask, why should the Palestinian Authority enjoy observer status, but a country that has done more for African nations and the African people be denied the same privilege? It was Israel and not the Palestinian Authority or even the Arab League that worked with African nations, helping them to develop their infrastructure, building roads, hospitals, schools, and so much more when these nations gained their independence from colonial powers. But oh, goes the lie, Israel must be isolated from the global community due to its crimes against humanity. African nations are expected to, and have indeed made peace and established diplomatic and trade relations with nations that colonized us, enslaved our people, and slaughtered us like animals. Israel, who we are told to shun, has committed no such atrocities against Africans. Durban One enabled and Durban 4 will strengthen a program of action that has emboldened actions which have the stench of apartheid-style behavior towards Black people. Africans cannot independently do as they wish, cannot believe as they wish, cannot associate with whom they wish, and cannot speak as they wish. As a proud daughter of the African continent, a daughter who longs to see the belated upliftment of her people, I respectfully ask African leaders, what has the BDS movement done for your people? How has lending support for Jew hatred progressed the needs of the continent? We have propped up the morally and legally corrupt notions that Israel is guilty of racism, colonization, and genocide. To what benefit? What has the payoff for Africans been? The United Nations' obsessive focus with Israel has resulted in Africa not receiving the attention or help in addressing the palpable dangers facing the continent. Terrorist groups in Africa are growing in both reach and effectiveness. According to the most recent terrorism index, 7 of the 10 highest countries are on the African continent. During 2020, of the 5 countries to experience the biggest falls in their index rating worldwide, 4 were in Africa. Only 2 African countries improved their risk rating. Africa is now the eye of the global terrorism storm. Boko Haram has kidnapped our girls and Al-Shabaab has killed our youth at universities. The Fulani herdsmen are slaughtering our Nigerian Christian brothers and sisters, and an emerging ISIS-inspired organization is leading a terrorist insurgence in Southern Africa. The center of gravity for Islamic State has now reportedly moved from the Middle East to Africa. This should give us all great pause for concern. This should be an agenda item from and form the center of any world conference dealing with human rights. The Durban One Declaration acknowledged that, and I quote, major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance against Africans and the people of African descent, close quote. And yet, when nations of the world gather on September 22 to commemorate Durban One, the theme for the debate is, I quote, reparations, racial justice, and equality for people of African descent. Africans and their human rights have notably been left out. A conference that stole the African narrative, specifically the South African narrative, is now completely ignoring Africa altogether. African issues are being sacrificed on the altar of feigned concern for human rights abuses in the Middle East. Who will speak up on behalf of the over 1 million Africans enslaved this very day? Innocent Africans are literally paying with their lives and their freedom for the United Nations anti-Semitic stance against Israel. Mauritania was elected to sit on the United Nations Human Rights Commission in 2019, despite its record of human rights abuses, including slavery. Libya and Nigeria have also been given seats on this commission despite their human rights atrocities. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is scheduled to speak at Durban 4. Mr. President, I implore you not to speak at the upcoming conference, which seeks to further legitimize a fallacy at the expense of the African people. South Africa's support of the Durbin Conference is an affront to the South Africans who fought for the freedom, some with their lives, that Black people like you and I enjoy today. Our involvement trivializes the very real experiences and the pain of apartheid that only we know. It downplays the courage, the hope, the tenacity, and the resilience of South Africans who are today doing what they can to create a sustainable and prosperous future for themselves and generations to follow. Our support for the Palestinian people should be lent where it will change the status quo. And that is in demanding their liberation from Hamas and Palestinian leadership that denies them basic and fundamental human rights. Who is advocating for their right to vote, their right to freedom of speech, for women's rights and so many various other rights? We have for far too long lent our name and our land to the centrality of a program that seeks to demonize and isolate the Jewish state, more so than it seeks to improve the lives of the Palestinian people. Durban 4 is morally repugnant for South Africa, for African nations and all nations of the world that truly believe in human rights for all people. They should not be participating in this upcoming conference. Several countries have already pulled out of Durban 4, but more countries, particularly African countries, must pull out and reject this gathering of hate. 46 of the 55 countries in Africa have diplomatic relations with Israel, and yet Africa is expected to, and unfortunately, in places such as the United Nations, fulfills this expectation of shunning Israel and the Jewish people. This must come to an end. African nations must return to the example set by the African Queen Makeda of Sheba 3,000 years ago. African nations are to lead the world in diplomatic and trade relations with Israel. As I close, I would like to encourage world leaders, world bodies, non-governmental organizations, religious and cultural institutions, as well as global citizens who desire to see human rights enjoyed by all and protected in relation to all people. May we follow the words of the prophet Isaiah, who said, "Learn to do good, seek justice, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow, and rebuke the oppressor."
I want to highlight the plight of the Palestinian people and the call on the review conference to look into the human rights situation in the occupied Arab territories with the view to implement the provisions stipulated in the DDBA.
What I wanted to say has just been said by His Excellency, the representative of Iran, when he reaffirmed the necessity of increasing the international awareness of the implications of racist behavior by the occupying authorities and the results which come from a racist ideology.
Pastor Dumisani Washington is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel and the former diversity outreach coordinator for the over 10 million member Christians United for Israel. In addition to being a pastor, he is a professional musician, graduate of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and author, whose latest book is the second edition of Zionism and the Black Church: Why Standing with Israel Will Be a Defining Issue for Christians of Color in the 21st Century. Thank you so much for joining us.
So I'm going to just share some of this topic, from this view, based not just on the book that I've written, Zionism and the Black Church, but on a broad view. As we often say with the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, we don't claim to speak for the Black community. We claim to be a voice in the Black community that stands with Israel, that stands in solidarity with the Jewish people, and that recognizes that Zionism is not only the liberation struggle of the Jewish people, it is a universal call. It has inspired so many throughout the decades, including the Black community, when it comes to self-determination, when it comes to establishing peace and safety and security for our people. The 2001 Durbin Conference, that was ostensibly against racism, unfortunately, we all know, was anything but. And it was another rallying cry for Israel haters and anti-Semites to come together and denounce the one and only Jewish state yet again. We know that from the reestablishment of the state of Israel in 1948, that 2001 was not by any stretch the first time that Israel's enemies, and even unfortunately some international actors, came together to denounce and to demean and demonize Israel. But this marked a different chapter that spawned what we know now as the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, pitting Israel fraudulently as an apartheid state and using the oft-claimed wrong and false charges of genocide against the Arab Palestinian people and all of these other things that are applied to Israel not only they're not true, but they've had devastating consequences when it comes to how the world's attention is taken away from where there are genocide practices, where there are apartheid practices, especially in that same region of the world. We know that it's true, again, internationally, that while the United Nations and other quote unquote human rights bodies have spent time either passing resolutions or otherwise condemning Israel, there have been human rights atrocities that have happened and that continue to happen that are being ignored. We know about the Libyan slave trade, where over 1 million Africans are sold into slavery, and virtually nothing has been done about that, not to mention the other Africans that are enslaved throughout North Africa and the Middle East. And this is aiming true for the United States. What we've had, unfortunately, with the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions issue is other organizations here in the States that have latched on to that same anti-Israel, anti-Semitic campaign and have championed BDS in many different ways. And it has manifested on our college campuses, in our city councils, in different ways. And I'll kind of expound on that. Unfortunately, again, one of the most notable ways that this has happened is by groups that claim to be concerned not only about human rights, not only about civil rights, but particularly about Black lives and Black human rights in the United States. And none other has been more known and visible over the past several years than Black Lives Matter. It was formed in 2013 after the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon Martin in Florida, and gained national and international prominence the next year, 2014, after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson. And it was in those demonstrations that we first saw the hashtag and the slogan "From Ferguson to Palestine." It took some people aback because they were trying to understand why a group that was fighting for the dignity of Black lives in the United States, how did it come to link arms with an anti-Israel movement and call itself pro-Palestinian, which it isn't even pro-Palestinian in terms of the lies, because it says nothing about the human rights abuses that are inflicted on the Palestinian people every day by Hamas, by Fatah, by Islamic Jihad, and by the Palestinian Authority. No, it was singularly focused on demonizing Israel. And why do we connect that to the BDS and the Durban One Conference? Well, the rhetoric is almost identical. You could go to the Movement for Black Lives website and you'll see the same things, that Israel's called an apartheid state. Israel's is accused of committing genocide against the Palestinians. The problem, obviously, as you know, Anne, when it comes to rhetoric, is that you keep repeating it over and over and over again, and it becomes seared in the consciousness of the people. After a while, if there's nothing pushing back, there's nothing that's giving truth, there's nothing that's actually challenging the lies, these things are not just accepted, they become taught as they're taught now. You have the critical ethnic studies curriculum that has been made law for all of California state universities, and it too accuses Israel of these same atrocities, and it encourages its students to boycott Israel. This has been a very, very controversial thing, and some of that same curriculum has made it into the primary grades as well. And some of the other states have been inspired by this, and they've been adopting their own versions of this. Again, what is at the foundation of these wrong-headed ideas? It has much to do with what happened at the Durbin Conference, that once Israel was, in Israel's enemies' minds, successfully attached with the word apartheid and with the words genocide. Once that happened, and it happened with the approval of the United Nations and its seal, well, that for many people, particularly if they're not aware of the reality on the ground, became gospel. And it is championed as a social justice, as a human rights issue, that somehow, if you have human rights credibility, if you have any type of morality about you, unfortunately, what has been placed forth in pop culture is that you will then automatically be anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. Those things have been connected together. Well, long before then, and you know this, Anne, long before you get to 2001, this playbook had already been written by then PLO leader Yasser Arafat, again, leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization from 1969 to, I believe, around 2004 when he passed away. The PLO, as I mentioned in my book, is a KGB invention. This is not hearsay. This is not a conspiracy theory. This has all been documented. Yasser Arafat was charged with leading that organization, and that organization spouted Soviet disinformation, which was codified by Stalin back in 1949, 1950. It was an anti-Zionist move by Stalin, and the whole point of it was to drive a wedge between Israel and the United States. And after NATO had been formed, Stalin knew that he could not fight against the powers, the Western powers that had come together. So he sought to use the Jews as a dividing issue and to attack the Jews, to stir up anti-Semitism within Israel, within the United States and the United States allies. And this is part of what Yasser Arafat's goal was. And it goes further, because the question would be, what does that have to do with the Black community? Well, Yasser Arafat then immediately reaches out to what is called then the militant wing of the Black civil rights movement, to the members of the Black Panthers, to people like Kwame Ture, who was formerly Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, and others, Angela Davis. Yes, this is where, when we talk about this radicalization of what was to be a Black civil rights movement, yes, what we call the younger lions, if you will. By that time, Dr. King and he himself was in his late 30s, not old by any stretch, but for those who are in their late teens, early 20s, it's old enough. And they were dismissive of Dr. King and the civil rights establishment, not just the nonviolent struggle for change, right? But also Dr. King's steadfast alliance with Israel and the Jewish people, his advocacy for peace, but he definitely never condemned Israel, never used the term Zionist as some sort of derogatory term. He fought for and was very articulate in his stance against anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and he spoke in large part for the civil rights community of that day. It is interesting to note that he was assassinated in 1968, and it was the year after that Yasser Arafat took control of the PLO. And what does he do? He goes right to the militant wing of the Black civil rights movement, and he begins to continue to foment the anti-Zionism that had begun to creep in to that younger crowd. And this is when you would hear these types of things being said. You would hear that if you were truly fighting for Black civil rights, you were then also aligned with the Palestinian movement. Again, all fraudulent, but long before you get to 2001, long before you get to the Durbin Conference, the seeds were being sown. And then the deeper question again is still why? Why did Yasser Arafat do that? I talk about this in my book as well. What we see is that when you're talking about civil rights, and you're talking about this type of struggle against tyranny, the struggle against fascism, the struggle against hatred and racism, well, there is no more iconic group of people than it would be the civil rights leaders of the 1950s and the 1960s. And Dr. King himself said, and I quote, "There's been no other ethnic group more present in the Negro struggle for justice than the Jew." So the iconic picture, if you will, would be of Dr. King and Rabbi Joshua Heschel standing shoulder to shoulder, marching in Selma, encouraging each other, fighting with each other. The Jewish community, as Dr. King said, overrepresented in the civil rights struggle. We don't believe for one moment that that was lost on someone like Yasser Arafat, who had genocidal aims when it came to Israel. His river to the sea, that whole mentality had nothing to do with land. I tell people often that the PLO was actually formed in 1964, and Israel did not even have access to Judea and Samaria and united Jerusalem until 1967. So then the rhetorical question is, what were they liberating? And the question is, they were trying to liberate, quote unquote, all of Palestine they saw from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And it was always a move to eliminate Israel and the Jewish people. And unfortunately, as Yasser Arafat sold this he turned it into a justice issue. And he stood on the floor of the United Nations, I believe it was in 1974. And he went on and on. Bayard Rustin, one of Dr. King's close friends and allies, who actually started an organization in 1975 called BASIC, Black Americans to Support Israel Committee, talked about Yasser Arafat's speech that year in the United Nations and how he kept using words like justice and fairness and equality. And he kept accusing Israel of racism. He kept seeing this word. He kept, again, that word association. Every time he would say Israel, he'd have some sort of derogatory word. And Bayard Rustin, remember, noted in his article that was entitled PLO, Freedom Fighters or Terrorists. He noted that Yasser Arafat said it so many times that it began to gain credibility even among some of the more sage civil rights leaders, just because they were hearing those words. They had not actually investigated those claims, and some began to accept it. So when Bayard Rustin formed this organization, there were stalwarts of both the civil rights community and throughout the Black community who were members of that organization, including Ralph Abernathy, including A. Philip Randolph, Coretta Scott King, Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. You had these people, and they take to an activism that stood in solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people, and simultaneously defending what I often call the Black struggle for freedom, not being willing for words like racism. And then later on in this 2001 Durbin Conference, words then like apartheid. The mentality was that not only were these charges against Israel not true, right? Not only is Israel the freest nation in the region then and now, but the reality of it is words like apartheid and Jim Crow and racism have real connotations for people who truly experience those things. Just like for our Jewish brothers and sisters, the word Holocaust should not be used lightly or frivolously. It is a word that has deep significance for our Jewish brothers and sisters. To use it to anywhere I see fit when it's something that I just don't like and rubs me the wrong way, not only is it completely offensive to the people who actually who experienced it, but it also takes away from where true genocides are happening, where these things are, like right now as we are talking, there's a genocide of Christian and Igbo in Nigeria being slaughtered by the thousands every couple of months, and the media silent. Why? In large part because it's focused on these false claims about Israel as an apartheid state. This Durbin Conference of 2001 has had devastating effects. Our organization is focused on not only just turning that, but seeing a new day. And I say often, and I'll close with this, not only are we focused on seeing something happening on the ground, we have different initiatives that we are launching now. We believe we're going to see a sea change. We are optimistic enough to believe that as dark as it has become, there will be a bright light, and we're looking forward to being a part of that new beginning.
Today, we do not only commemorate Durban, but we reaffirm and renew our firm global political commitment to the full and effective implementation of the DDPA and the outcome of Durban Review in 2009.
Today's meeting constitutes an opportunity to recommit to the full and effective implementation of the actions outlined in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, the most comprehensive framework for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance.
Professor Eugene Kontorovich is a professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia School of Law and the director of its Center for International Law in the Middle East. He is recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on international law and the Israeli-Arab conflict. His scholarship has been cited in leading international law cases around the world. Professor Kontorovich is also the head of the International Law Department at the Kohelet Policy Forum, a Jerusalem-based think tank. He is regarded as the intellectual architect of US state laws regarding boycotts of Israel. We're so glad you could be with us here today, Eugene.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And we're going to talk about the apartheid accusation against Israel. The apartheid accusation is extraordinary because it represents a modern version of the big lie. That is to say, it's a claim which is not merely somewhat at odds with the truth. It has no points of intersection with the truth and is from a parallel universe of the truth, making it actually harder to argue against it from a reality-based perspective. So what makes this claim so extraordinary? Apartheid is a very particular international crime, an unusual and extraordinary international crime. To accuse a state of being an apartheid state is different from saying it has bad practices or discriminates. For example, America is often accused of being a racist country or a country with police brutality against minorities. But even these critics don't call it an apartheid state. So an apartheid state is a country that practices forms of racial segregation and dominance comparable to, similar to those of apartheid South Africa. And that's very important to know that the crime is called apartheid to suggest practices similar to those in apartheid South Africa. And that is why, quite unusually, it has an Afrikaner name. The name is borrowed from the institutionalized practices of racial separation and subordination in South Africa. So what was the core of the practices of South Africa? You had a white minority that subjugated a Black majority by depriving them of all political power and representation, and maintaining a system of complete racial separation, right? That's the apart in apartheid. So, for example, there were separate facilities, public facilities, theaters, water fountains, buses. There were separate places to live, separate districts. And Blacks were herded and forcibly deported into enclaves where they would be forced to live. So that's the apart in apartheid, that the Blacks had no political rights and maintained, were kept in a system of complete complete social separation to highlight their subjugation. So, of course, applying this to Israel, it's quite extraordinary, because in Israel, there are no facilities that are publicly separated. There's not a single theater, there's not a single cafe where admission depends on one's ethnicity, not inside the Green Line and not in the settlements. So in the settlements, there are cafes where Arabs and Jews sit together. There is not a single facility that depends on one's ethnicity to get in. And indeed, we know that Israel, of course, has Arabs in the Supreme Court, Arabs currently in the government, and in every prominent position. And there's not a single public facility or business where there is a system where there's any discrimination based on ethnicity, and it's really so there's simply no apartness. And as for political rights, of course, inside, so Arabs who are Israeli citizens or Israeli residents have political rights, or can have political rights in Israel. That is how an Arab party comes to be in the current ruling coalition of Israel. They have full equal political rights. Now, in the areas governed by the Palestinian Authority, Arabs also have political rights. They're represented in the Palestinian Authority. And whenever the Palestinian Authority decides to have its elections, they can vote in them. And indeed, the international community regards Mahmoud Abbas as the elected leader of the Palestinians. Now, how can he have that international regard if Palestinians don't have elections? And in fact, the Palestinian government passes the laws under which Palestinians live. In apartheid South Africa, a minority government of whites made the tax laws, which taxed the blacks, drafted blacks into the army, and otherwise governed every aspect of their lives. In Judea and Samaria, in the areas where the Palestinian Authority governs, which was where 90% of the Palestinians live, all of the daily life of the Palestinians, their taxes, their education is governed by the Palestinian Authority. And if you would say, oh, well, you know, the South Africa had Bantustans, black governments that South Africa claimed was independent, but the international community didn't recognize them as such. So South Africa completely controlled the government of the Bantustans. And that is why the international community did not recognize them as independent governments. But of course, the international community does recognize the Palestinian Authority as an independent government, so much so that they've been admitted as a member, been recognized as a state by the General Assembly of the United Nations. No Bantustan ever had that status. So there's absolutely no comparison. There's absolutely no basis for this. The Israeli Knesset does not legislate for the Palestinians. And for those Arabs who it does legislate for, Israeli Arabs, they enjoy full political participation. So then let's stop and think for a minute. If this allegation is so baseless, why is it made? Because, you know, if you wanted to accuse Israel of something bad but credible, maybe it would be more plausible to say, you know, Israel has some policies we don't like. We disapprove of some Israeli policies. To criticize particular policies rather than to call the country an apartheid state. Because it's worth noting, how many countries has the international community deemed apartheid states other than South Africa? None. So it's a very high standard to meet. But one aspect of the apartheid claim is it's what I call a modern blood libel. That is to say, it's structurally identical to medieval blood libels. Now, what was a medieval blood libel? A medieval blood libel was a claim which was made repeatedly and resulted in horrible pogroms against the Jews. The Jews used Christian children's blood to make Passover matzahs. Now, that's a particularly extraordinary claim to make, because anyone who actually knows Jews, that they are particularly scrupulous not to eat blood under any circumstances, and are very scrupulous what they put in their matzah. Now, that makes it implausible. So why make this claim? First of all, because it separates it from reality. And so it's like in its own world of reality. You can't impeach it from reality. But also because the claims made against the Jews are not claims based on truth. They're claims that resonate most powerfully and most emotionally with the dominant social values. So in the Middle Ages, when the blood libel claim was made, people took Catholicism or Russian Orthodoxy, Christian Orthodoxy very seriously. That was a major part of people's lives. And the blood libel immediately evoked the Last Supper and the betrayal of Jesus, supposedly by the Jews. So that immediately touched a nerve, the deepest nerve. So it doesn't matter if it wasn't true, right? People might dismiss it or not even think it's true, but it touches a nerve. And so making the apartheid claim, it touches a nerve in what's considered the most sensitive and delicate issues today, questions of racial justice. And so even if the claim is not accepted, and most people who hear it won't accept it, simply having it be part of the atmosphere creates an atmosphere of delegitimization around Israel, an atmosphere of poisoning attitudes towards Israel. Because there's another reason, there's a particular reason why call it an apartheid state? Why not just call it a state that does some things we disagree with? Because if there's a country that has racial policies, let's say, that you disagree with, like the United States, for most progressives, the remedy is to change those policies, not to abolish the country. but with an apartheid state. The remedy for South African apartheid was to end the regime. And calling Israel an apartheid state is now a subtle way of calling for the destruction of Israel and the dissolution of the Israeli government as it's currently constituted. Right? The solution for apartheid is regime change, and that's one of the powerful aspects of the claim. Now, I want to say, to be sure, it's not completely ridiculous to speak of apartheid when it comes to the Palestinians. We're just talking about the Palestinian part of the population, because, of course, it sounds a little bit like apartheid. If you have a system where a disfavored ethnic group is not allowed to buy land or enjoy property rights, it sounds a little bit like apartheid if the government engages in the extrajudicial killing, pays for the murder of members of the disfavored group. It sounds a little bit like apartheid if you have a government policy to delegitimize and portray as inferior and dirty members of the disfavored minority group. Now, those are all policies that Israel does not pursue, but they are, in fact, policies that are the official government policy of the Palestinian Authority, which makes real estate transactions with Jews a high crime, which has a pay-for-slay program that subsidizes and incentivizes the murder of Jews, and whose school books are full of such anti-Semitic material that even the EU has come to be disgusted by it and describe it as anti-Semitic. That all sounds like, right, you can't buy land, you can't sell land to members of a group, you hunt down and pay for the murder of members of the group, beginning to sound a little bit like apartheid. So the great irony is that the apartheid it's not just not the truth, it's the inversion of the truth. Right? If there's apartheid anywhere in the area, it would be on the part of the Palestinians. And I think the answer to the apartheid argument against Israel is not to refute it, because it's not a truth-based argument. Rather, you attack the criticism. But in this case, it's important for people to know that there are clearly racially discriminatory policies. An Arab can buy land in Israel, but a Jew cannot buy land in any area governed by the Palestinian Authority. What do you call that? So that's an argument that needs to be made. If there's anything like apartheid here, it is on the part of the Palestinians. Now, again, I wouldn't call it apartheid because, in fact, under international law, the standard for apartheid is, let's say, almost impossibly high. It's almost a unique offense, a one-off. But what they're trying to do is delegitimize Israel, create a polite way to call for regime change in Israel, and additionally, to try to egg on the International Criminal Court to add apartheid to the numerous other offenses it is investigating Israel for, such as allowing Jews to live in Judea and Samaria. I don't think the International Criminal Court is going to go for it. And I think the fact that they have had many years to think about it and have not extended the investigation to apartheid shows how implausible the claim is. But certainly as the ICC moves closer towards opening a full investigation of what they call the situation in Palestine involving Israel, there's also a last-minute push to have the ICC label Israel as an apartheid state. And this is the culmination of the Durban agenda of using international law tools to fundamentally delegitimize Israel.
To put an end to racism and discrimination, the international community is more than ever called to reiterate its commitment to the implementation of the Durbin Declaration Program of Action, as well as to the 2009 Durban Review Conference, which remain the fundamental frameworks for the effective elimination of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance.
Is particularly attached to the right to freedom of expression. However, exercise of this right should not have the effect of legitimizing a new form of politically correct anti-Semitism, now targeting Arabs.
Kenneth Marcus is founder and chairman of the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. He was Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education for Civil Rights from 2018 to 2020. His many published works include The Definition of Anti-Semitism and Jewish Identity and Civil Rights in America. Under his leadership, the U.S. Department of Education for Civil Rights decided to employ what has become known as the IRA definition of anti-Semitism when examining questions of anti-Semitism on college campuses under Title VI. The Jewish News Syndicate has written of his tenure, "In 2 short years, he did as much, if not more, to fight anti-Semitism on college campuses as anyone in government has ever done." Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Anne, both for those kind words and for including me in this important conference. On October 22nd, the United Nations will hold a major international conference to mark the 20th anniversary of its World Conference Against Racism. In many ways, that conference has marked us more than we mark it. For supporters, it was an epoch-making event, an awakening about racism for a world then not yet woke. At the same time, it was what we might now call a super spreader event, causing a new anti-Zionist variant of the world's oldest hatred to go viral. This month, as we observe the anniversary of what we now may consider the worst post-Holocaust international manifestation of anti-Semitism, we must pledge to end not only Durban, but the hate-filled worldview that it represents. This year, the United Nations and some 15 of its allies will boycott the high-level commemorative meeting known as Durbin 4 because of the anti-Semitism associated with that event. The facts are well established. In preparation for the original Durbin Conference, several nations met in Tehran in February 2001 and prepared a formal text that accused Israel of committing a new kind of apartheid, a crime against humanity, and a form of genocide. Durbin provided a forum for inflammatory tirades against Israel, including Yasser Arafat's accusation of the ugliness of Israeli so-called racist policies and practices. Fidel Castro alleged that Israel was perpetuating a dreadful genocide at this very moment against our Palestinian brothers. Worse, the UN sponsored a parallel NGO forum where non-governmental organizations maligned Israel as a racist apartheid state guilty of genocide. In a Palestinian-led march, one placard read, "Hitler should have finished the job." Nearby, copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were being sold. Activists distributed flyers with caricatures of Jews with hooked noses, fangs dripping with blood, clutching money. Jewish activists were intimidated, threatened, and told, "You don't belong to the human race." In light of these horrors, it is not enough to praise the countries that will boycott Durbin 4 or to oppose the many more that apparently still plan to participate. Beyond that, we must face the reality that the United Nations has found it necessary to stage yet another major international event to commemorate this grand global travesty. To do that, we need to understand why so many people still support Durbin despite its ugly legacy. For those who celebrate Durbin, that conference defined our new understanding of race and inaugurated a new understanding that racism is inherent to our global system. The conference hung a spotlight on racial supremacy and violent nationalism long before most people were aware of the dangers of those vicious impulses. Supporters recall that Durbin 1, as that original conference is now called, laid the foundation for the world to believe and to accept that systemic racism is at the core of our global system and that it advances both consciously and unconsciously. Over the last 2 decades, this worldview has taken hold internationally, nowhere more than in the United States. For many, Durbin represents the war on white supremacy as a global or national system. It also reflects the growing worldview that capitalism is unsustainable, as is the global influence or hegemony of the United States. These understandings are reflected in critical race theory, the Black Lives Matter movement, and a host of other social spin-offs, including many mainstream government, corporate, and educational programs. Too often, these movements have adopted not only Durbin's commendable opposition to racism, but also its tragic descent into other forms of hatred. This can be seen, for example, in cases where university training sessions now separate employees by race, treating Jews and whites as privileged oppressors and teaching other groups to view Jews in stereotypical terms. Under the rubric of critical race theory, some public school students are immersed in similar stereotypes. In California, supporters of a first draft ethnic studies curriculum would promote the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel and omit lesson plans about anti-Semitism. For those who are committed to ending racism, this new anti-racism is a diversion from the real hard work of civil rights enforcement. Instead of identifying actual instances of discrimination where people are treated worse because of their race or other group identity, the Durbinist approach is to overhaul our social order, dividing people up based on their perceived status as oppressor or oppressed. This invariably feeds into racial stereotypes, with Jews viewed in anti-Semitic terms as privileged, powerful, conspiratorial, and controlling. It is a harvesting of the hate spawned in Durbin, but it is also an avoidance of the real and continuing problem of discrimination. There is good news. The 16 countries or so that will boycott Durbin 4 reflect an increase over the 14 which skipped Durbin 3, or the 10 that pulled out of Durbin 2 back in 2009. But we must do more than pull out of Durbin. We must pull out of Durbanism. That is to say, we must extirpate the hate that Durbin has spread not only in our international institutions, but also in our schools, our campuses, and our workplaces. Fortunately, the pullout from Durbin reflects a growing global awareness of the need to respond forcefully to the growing and spreading hate of global anti-Semitism. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, has a working definition of anti-Semitism that has now been adopted by some 30 nations, many within just the last couple of years, and is now embraced by the European Union, the Organization of American States, the Council of Europe, and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, among others. If you're not familiar with this IRA working definition, I should say a few words about it. When combating anti-Semitism, definitions are extremely important because administrators and officials so frequently fail to identify anti-Semitism when it deviates from the classic European and right-wing formulations, especially when it relates in some fashion to the state of Israel and tends to be confused with mere political discourse. Standard definitions are also important for training, education, and comparison of data sets. And the IRA definition is especially crucial because it is the only internationally agreed upon definition of anti-Semitism, and it has the force of law in some countries. In its prefatory language, the IRA working definition says that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. But the real work is done by the examples, especially the examples relative to Israel. The working definition acknowledges that criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Taking into account the overall context, however, IRA acknowledges that examples of anti-Semitism could include denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g., by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Recall that this is central to what was said and done at Durbin. The Obama-Biden administration helpfully presented the working definition in its proper context by emphasizing its congruence with Natan Sharansky's so-called 3D test. Sharansky, you may recall, previously explained that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but some of it is, and it is important to know the difference. Specifically, Sharansky explained that it may be anti-Semitic to demonize or delegitimize the Jewish state or to use double standards when evaluating the actions of Israel. This is the heart of the IRA working definition. And it is important to understand why these 3 Ds, double standards, delegitimization, and demonization, are so important. Sharansky explained that when people demonize Israel, not just criticizing it, but acting as if it had a sinister, demonic, or otherworldly evil, they are treating Israel much as anti-Semites have treated Jews for 2,000 years or more. In other words, they are treating Israel as the collective Jew, the Jew among nations. It's the same when they delegitimize Israel, alone among the world's nations, which is to say, when they treat Israel as if it lacked moral legitimacy, just as they have so long done with the Jewish people as a whole. These examples in the IRA working definition, in other words, are all about discerning continuities between some anti-Zionism and the anti-Semitic hatred that long preceded it. Now, some people are reluctant to use IRA based on the mistaken view that it is controversial or that it suppresses free speech. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. To be sure, there are some people who have criticized IRA, but every advance in civil and human rights has faced criticism. Support for IRA is remarkably widespread around the world. According to the Cantor Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry at Tel Aviv University, over 450 organizations have embraced the IRA working definition, ranging from football clubs like Chelsea to corporations like Volkswagen, to the religious groups, such as the Global Imams Council. Moreover, the IRA definition poses no more threat to free speech than any other legal tool. When properly used, for example, in the way required currently by the United States Executive Order on Combating Anti-Semitism, it does not suppress any speech at all. Rather, it serves as a means to identify conduct that, if anti-Semitic, would violate generally applicable civil rights standards. There is no more important step that nations, counties, municipalities, sports leagues, universities, and other entities can take than to adopt this important definition, which strikes a blow against global anti-Semitism. Beyond that, we must seek out and eliminate Durbanism wherever it arises, replacing it with a genuine commitment to equal opportunity. Instead of dividing people by race, we must unite. Instead of using racism as a pretext to pursue broad political agendas, we should return to the hard work of fighting discrimination in every case where it arises. If Durbin awakened some people to the reality of racism, we must redirect the energies of the newly awakened to fighting discrimination where it appears. When pulling out of Durbin, we must pull into the fight against anti-Semitism and racism.
بل تعرضت للنتائج السلبية لانتشارهما وتفاقمهما في مناطق أخرى. وإذا كانت ظاهرة الإسلاموفوبيا مرفعا فعليا في الدول المشرقية كونها سامية الأساس، فإن ما يطرح اليوم حول يهودية إسرائيل